This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Tyler D. Parry, who teaches in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He is the author of a number of scholarly and public-facing essays and has published Jumping the Broom, The Surprising Multicultural Origins of a Black Wedding Ritual from 2020, and with Robert Greene II, Invisible No More, The African American Experience at the University of South Carolina in 2021. In this conversation, we explore the importance of regional attentiveness in writing Black history in the United States, thinking Blackness in the Southwest, and the expansiveness of the Black Studies Archive and imagination. Good afternoon, Tyler. How are you today?
I'm doing great, John. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Really excited to have a chance to talk with you today for a number of reasons. I think that your research is super interesting, really important, to the field of Black studies, but also your particular focus, like your methodologies and all those things I think are very interesting. But your specific focus is, I think, really unique and important in terms of expanding our understanding of African American history and culture. And so having you on the podcast, I'm excited for all those whole range of reasons. And I have a real fondness for desert landscapes. And so although we are not in person and I'm unfortunately not out in Las Vegas, I have a kind of affection for, anyone reporting from the desert. So anyway, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast.
No, it's great to be here. Yeah, we're surviving out here in the Southwest. But I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Well, we'll have a chance, of course, to talk about your portrait of the field, your imagination of the field of Black studies and how your research fits into it and pushes boundaries and all that. But I really wanted to start with a more personal question and ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life, and what keeps you connected to and sustains you in this work?
This is a great question to start out with. And, as the older I get, the more I think in retrospect of, when does this start, like my intellectual journey? I think the first place to begin is that I'm actually from Las Vegas, Nevada. So kind of an unusual position in that I get to teach the institution that represents my home city, as well as the place that I got my BA in history. So I was able to return to Las Vegas. But, I was born in the mid-'80s when Las Vegas was rapidly changing and growing, and then came of age in the '90s and early 2000s. And I set it up that way to note that most people my age who kind of claim Las Vegas as home tended to perceive the past as somewhat irrelevant to their own perspective of self, just because Las Vegas was predicated upon this idea that growth and expansion were the key to the future, and that anything that happened previously it's not that it's unimportant, but not necessarily worth your time to think too much about. Like, what is the history of Las Vegas? Maybe the mob, maybe a mafia history that's popularly portrayed. Maybe something about the Hoover Dam, but there was not really a sense coming of age, even going through the public school system here, that you thought much about the past in general and its relevance to the present. It's changing now, I think, but when I was coming of age, the context of living here and growing up here in Las Vegas was one to which I would have never imagined myself being a scholar or a historian that investigates these types of questions that I now do for a living. But, I think I was somewhat typical as a person that was born and raised here, in that my ambitions for higher education had maybe a limited focus. I didn't necessarily see myself having to go anywhere necessarily for higher ed. I didn't have a dream institution. I always did fairly well in my K through 12 classes. But there was this moment to where, there's a kind of a separate story to how this happens, but the governor, when I was in middle school, kind of instituted this scholarship for local Nevadans, so people who graduate from a Nevada high school, to where if you elect to go to one of the public institutions here, you have a massive scholarship. It's called the Millennium Scholarship. And so for those of us who decided to stay at home, this was a great deal. So my college experience, my university experience was somewhat atypical, I think, with most academics, in the sense that I've never lived in a dorm. I lived at home. I commuted to campus. I worked 32 to 40 hours a week. I actually worked at a casino for part of my time as an undergraduate in history. But it wasn't until, I took a class in it was either the end of my second year or the beginning of my third year. I kind of forget the time. I started out as a communications major. I thought I was going to be, a DJ or something along those lines. That's what I was into. Music was kind of a vantage point for how I saw myself in my career. I was always interested in radio. So ironically, I do podcasts now with a lot of people. Uniquely enough, it kind of came full circle. But I say all that to kind of set up that the moment that I often think about as what actually changed my trajectory of self and starting to understand how the past matters in a more literal sense is I took a course by a professor named Kevin Dawson, who's now at UC Merced, but he was at UNLV at the time. He offered a course called Comparative Slavery. And I think to set this up for listeners, those of us maybe in our 40s might remember the process a little bit better, but not everything was online at that time. We still kind of worked through the books, and there wasn't a huge course description. There was not a lot about this professor. It wasn't this era where you looked them up online to find out who they were. So this was, circa 2006. Had no idea who he was. I think he had just been hired at UNLV at that time, but I took the course because it fit within my work schedule. So I entered the class and, the shorter version of a much longer story is that the way he presented this material on people of African descent from Western Africa to the Americas was like no other approach I had ever seen in history, as far as like a study of history. Because the conventional narrative of how I think most people understood and understand even to this day when I speak to my own students about slavery is you just envision nameless workers on a plantation who can't be recovered in the historical record. But he introduced me to reading a lot of Equiano, Venture Smith's narratives, people taken from Western Africa, writing about their experiences. And the whole point of the course was that people of African descent were centralized within the narrative, not secondary to the broader narrative of the Atlantic world. And I found myself reading everything in that course. I tended to be a pretty good reader in most of my classes, but I couldn't get enough of the material he was assigning. I mean, we were studying places like Brazil and Cuba. We were learning about West Africa. We were learning about how the context of North America was different than other slave societies. This was all very new information to me as someone who had not really been adequately trained in how to study the past in my K through 12 education, even my first couple of years at the university. And so this was one of those moments to where I was probably bothering that man way too much in his office hours. I was always there whenever I could be. And he very much modeled what it meant to be an exceptional, kind mentor. He understood kind of my questions. There was no stupid question. Everything was relevant. He taught me what it meant to get a PhD, what it means to be a professor, that you can do research for a living. Because, I have to admit that when I declared history as my major, a lot of people, the first question I think many people get is, well, what are you going to do with that? right? And, so the original conception was, well, you'll probably just end up going to law school anyway, right? But the narrative was changed because I figured out that also, if I'm going to spend money and time pursuing an education, I want to make sure I love this experience, then I come out of it with something that I felt very attached to. And so, the other aspect of that is I finished the course that semester, and then I find out that he's not going to be teaching an undergraduate class the next semester. And I was getting kind of ready to graduate by this point. I was moving pretty quickly to get my degree. And he invited me, and he had no reason to do this, but he invited me to take a graduate course as an undergraduate. I just had to get special permission from the chair. And so when you talk about that moment where someone actually believes in you, that was the moment for me to where I said, wow, this scholar who I really admire is really taking me under his wing and teaching me about even the application process
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
PhD program. And, he validated kind of all of the things that I was thinking about as far as, is this a possible career path for me? So that was the moment to where I think like my intellectual trajectory takes off. Like that's the genesis of it. And then from there, he recommended the University of South Carolina, which is where he went, which is where I would end up pursuing my PhD with the same mentor that he had in Daniel C. Littlefield. And yeah, that first moment taking that course, I think I basically owe probably about everything to that moment. And, the irony of this is that it was a course that fit within my schedule, but it was one of those
Lovely.
courses where the professor really and everyone loved him, like, everyone loved the class, but I just found myself like I couldn't get enough of it, and he accommodated that curiosity very well.
First of all, that's fantastic. I love these stories of chance, like encounters. I mean, really,
Yeah.
it fit the schedule, and your whole life is changed because of it. And but also the really deep reminder of, I mean, I think like this is our first week at University of Maryland this week. I mean, we were snowed in, so we didn't have a week, but next week is our first
Right.
week. And this is the dread of like putting the syllabus together and getting started and attendance, reading, and whatever, right? But these, like, for me, are such important reminders of the possible meaning of education and the very reality of the meaning of what we do in the classroom is,
Yeah.
these moments where sometimes it's a special moment where somebody believes in you and that changes you. I had a similar thing with Professor Patrick Burke, rest in peace, passed away recently.
Mm.
Um, and I took that with me, like, as a reason to be a professor. I was like, this is a magical and amazing thing to be able to do. And
Yep.
when it's added that chance of like it fit your schedule, it's just, I don't know that it'd be a hit film or plot line in a movie, but for academics, it would be. I
Sure,
absolutely
sure.
love that.
Well, yeah, if I could follow up on that, it does bring to mind this reality for me that it disrupted the notion, or at least the stereotype of the detached academic.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So even in kind of, popular belief, at least within a particular political perspective, the stereotype of professors is that we work twice a week and, we go home as soon as we can. You don't interact with students in any significant capacity. But my experience, thankfully, was very different than that. And so for me, I promised myself that if I ever became an academic, because there were never any guarantees that I would teach at a university, that I would model that type of behavior, that I would be accessible to students who are curious and who do find value in these concepts, not just within the classroom, but how they apply externally as well, because not all of them are going to be majors within my department, but they do believe these concepts are important and they want to be able to apply them in real time in whatever career that they do. So I had a great example to start out with in my academic career, and I never take that for granted.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate it, and also just love getting those names of people who play that role, getting their names said out loud on a podcast. So
Yeah.
happy
Yeah.
with that.
Shout out to Kevin Dawson.
Um, So let me pivot a little bit and ask you about Black Studies itself, and specifically, what is a portrait of Black Studies that you work with? And I always ask this in the context of a tension that lies at its origins that I think we still work with today,
Mm.
which is a tension between the commitment of the field to an intellectual tradition and the study of the intellectual tradition, and that sort of sense of intellectual life. That was part of the student demand in the late 1960s, that there wasn't a place to study Black life in any kind of systematic, sustained way in disciplines. Black studies became that place, right, where Black history, art, literature, etc., could be represented in its fullness, and we have that, I think, in the idea of what Black studies is, as a commitment to the intellectual tradition. But that moment was also a moment of radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where the distinction between a classroom and a community, between books and political action and campus and mobilization, in relation to injustice or community self care and all these really blurred that boundary. And I think we inherit that in Black studies today, where Black studies is also about a certain politics and a commitment to a certain kind of liberation struggle and to community. And so, sort of in the context of that origin point and the tensions that we inherit from that, I'm interested how you think about the field of Black studies. What's that portrait you work with?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and you know, I when I went into my PhD program as kind of a conventional historian, like the idea that there's a method to doing history, um, the advantage that I think I had is I worked very closely with the African American Studies program, and that's an important kind of segue to understand my kind of approach to the study of Black life in history and in the present. Because the African American Studies program, at the time it was a program at the University of South Carolina, um, it basically had faculty who were hired kind of part-time in both their home department, so to speak, like English or history, political science, and then, half their time was spent in African American studies. And so my interactions with that program were so important for broadening my horizons as to how I think about the approach and methods under which one studies Black life. So I was interacting with people who were trained in political science, trained in English literature. I remember one scholar was doing a project on Black representation in comic books. And so I
I think she was on the podcast, Kiana Whitted.
Kiana, yeah,
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 she's on the
that's right,
podcast.
yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
sorry to
No, that's
interrupt.
that's great, yeah. Yeah, I always found that so compelling because it seemed like you could apply Black studies so broadly, and I think that's what was attractive to me because even if one looks at either my dissertation or my first book, um, I ask really these very kind of broad questions, and I'm willing to go into kind of broad chronologies and geographic territories. And I remember I was actually warned by another mentor that I had in my undergraduate career to where she said, and she didn't say this as a criticism, she was just warning me as to how academia can work, is that the only problem you're going to have is that you are interested in so many things simultaneously. And it seems
Uh-huh.
like you want to have all of them in the same thing that you do, which was true. I mean, it was a true statement. And so I actually found though that the Black studies approach to asking these questions is that it provided these broad contours and parameters to where I felt comfortable writing a dissertation where I was, doing 400 years of history, multiple continents, different generations of people in different areas. And, that was welcome as long as, the research and the scholarship was solid. So I say that to kind of set up the ways under which I entered Black studies, having a PhD that is only a history PhD,
Uh-huh.
in that working with the African American Studies faculty at University of South Carolina, was kind of what set the tone for the ways under which I
Uh,
envisioned myself as a scholar, even if I didn't entirely realize it at the time. But, the only job I've held in academia as far as a tenure track or tenured faculty member is within a Black Studies department. And I remember when I first went to Cal State Fullerton, which was my first job, wonderful group of people that I was able to work with there. The chair, at the time, whose name is Erica Ball, also a great mentor to me still to this day, she kind of set us all down because all of us came from different disciplines. Some were sociology, some was creative writing. I think people did performance studies. We had a poet on staff as well. Um, but we were all committed to, getting people to major, to grow the department in African American studies, but we're all coming from different disciplines. And so she asked us to kind of think, what is like a unifying feature or person that we can think about that might, make that statement of, this person does Black studies. This is kind of at least
uh,
one origin point. And she threw out the name W.B. Du Bois. And it made me think because, when people think of Black studies as just strictly an academic discipline, they might think of the late 1960s when these became programs or departments or a curriculum was designed within universities. And then that spread pretty rapidly throughout the United States in the subsequent decades. But when you look at the practice of Black studies prior to that kind of formal moment to where it was embedded within the curriculum of higher education, people like W.B. Du Bois, and I would also include Angela Davis as well as kind of a scholar activist, were doing a variety of different things that would, from our perspective, cross disciplines. So Du Bois was a historian, a sociologist. He studied crime. He wrote about anything that interested him as long as it was centering the Black experience and ensuring it was not secondary, rejecting Eurocentrism as kind of the norm for the study of the past or the present or the future as well. So I've always taken that component with me to where whenever I teach a Black Studies course, so for instance, I teach the 101 about every year, and I always ask the students, what do you want to get out of this class? And inevitably, they usually tell me, I want to know the history of Black people. I want to know the historical context. And I said, that's wonderful, and we will cover that. But I want to make sure you know this is not just a history course, that this is an interdisciplinary analysis of Black life, which uses multiple components of what we call traditional academia. So we'll use things from political science, we'll use things from sociology, we'll use tools that inform our broader understanding of African Americans. We don't just have to follow this chronology of change over time, but we can do things like themes week by week, and we should feel liberated to do so when we're studying this aspect and this subject. So, I mean, I always try to ensure that when I'm teaching Black Studies courses, even if they're cross-listed with the history department, I'm presenting students an understanding that this is not just, one thing or the other, but it's holistic, and that anyone from any discipline can feel comfortable studying this because it speaks to these broader questions that I think a lot of people are looking for. There's a lot of talk about interdisciplinarity, both at my own institution as well as many others. And my answer is usually always the same, in that interdisciplinarity is not new. For those who are in ethnic studies even more broadly, is that has always been a feature
mhm.
of these particular departments. And so, if you're looking for a reference point, you can learn a lot from the development of Black Studies curriculums, both within the late 1960s as well as how they developed today. And so, the last point that I'll make on this as more of a maybe localized understanding. So when I came to UNLV, kind of returning home to Las Vegas, I had a very different perspective on the city under which I grew up. And I think it's the typical kind of Marxist academic framework to where you simultaneously love and hate a place in many respects. Like, you love the people, the community, and the culture, but you reject kind of the consumerism, materialism that's swallowing it whole at the same time. And so my goal was to ensure that my position here was to represent what African American and African diaspora studies and other ethnic studies, gender and sexuality studies has to offer the student body. Because I was once a student at UNLV,
Mm.
and back then, what was called the Afro American Studies program, it existed, but in my opinion, it was just not visible. And so through no fault of, the students, a lot of people just didn't know what it was or what its relevance was to kind of a neoliberal institution that says that you have to get these credentials in order to get a job, right? And so from the perspective of many, that leaves out kind of these interdisciplinary studies frameworks. And so one thing that I started to do is the the Black Studies curriculum at UNLV was implemented first in 1969, following what was happening in San Francisco State. The Black Student Union here at UNLV was motivated and mobilized by that and demanded that there is a curriculum that would be developed within the university at the time. It eventually translates into an ethnic studies program that was attached to the anthropology department at one point, and kind of an interesting, history behind it. But the the founding director of what was called ethnic studies was an anthropologist, I believe, by training, but he was looking at Black life within Southern Nevada, which was something that nobody was doing in the context of
Yeah.
the 1970s. And I was reading his papers because he passed away in the 90s. He left some papers behind that are now at the Special Collections Archives. And so, I do love the historical methodology. I love going to archives, and during the pandemic, having a archive nearby just to go into was nice. So I started reading his papers, and he wrote this report where he was describing the process as to why ethnic studies and Black studies exists within UNLV. And he said at least one of the primary points was that this was due to community demand. That if you want to have a link to the community, particularly a diversifying Las Vegas, you have to have a program that represents that student population. And those students who don't identify as people of color also, can greatly benefit from having these courses. And as far as cultural awareness and cultural understanding and promoting a more just society. And so when I read that, that's also stuck with me as to where I have always tried to make myself available to community events. Sometimes that can take the form of a protest march. Sometimes that can take the form of uh, public lecture at a library. Sometimes that can take the form of just a community talk or just attending a meeting. And I think that the spirit of how I think about Black studies now is basically meeting the moment, understanding how the past remains relevant to the
Yeah.
present, and then disseminating that knowledge to the community and also learning from the community in the process.
I love that. Thank you for all of those. Extremely interesting, and I love the way it comes together in that moment of what does it mean to be responsive and available.
Yeah.
That's because what you gave there, obviously touched on institution, big origins, local origins,
Mm.
but that deeply personal moment of what does it mean to be available and present to where we are.
Yeah, and I think this really was encapsulated by, I guess, the context here that might be worth mentioning is that I returned to Las Vegas in the summer of 2019. So I had 1 semester before the lockdowns happened,
Oh,
and
wow.
then, right. Yeah, and so it was weird because I was coming back to an institution I had known in a different context, but then everything shut down, and I felt very distant from it to some degree just because everything was online, and so I finished my 2nd semester with, a partially online class when things had locked down here in March, and then the summer of 2020 happens. And one thing that started to occur is a lot of people had a lot of questions about what was going on. And I was being contacted by a variety of different media networks to weigh in on George Floyd, policing, things that, I had certainly thought about. I'd read some of the relevant works on it, but it also did remind me that, being a community-based scholar and being a person that's available does require one, I think, to read broadly and at least
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
be prepared to, because people are kind of looking toward expertise. They do see professors still and intellectuals and academics as people who can answer questions because the nature of what we do is we think, we write, and we speak, and then we teach. And so teaching is not just something I could confine to the classroom. This was never something I thought anyway, but it did become much more relevant when society was locked down and people were looking for answers and they couldn't necessarily go anywhere physically to find them. So it also it made me realize that returning home to Las Vegas and never believing that this place had a past that I was taught to think was terribly relevant to, like, my own perspective, working in the casinos or whatnot. I started to realize that there's more to the story of this place. There's more to the story of the mob or Howard Hughes or corporate gaming, but that it is the people that make the city beautiful. And particularly, it is the populations most marginalized that make the city better because they refuse to accept the status quo. And so that led me into the trajectory that I now pursue to where, I'm still very much, endeared toward Atlantic history. I like broad questions. I like looking at multiple experiences across continents and oceans. But I also am a local historian. I do local work, and I often speak about that local work because people who move to this place or who live here, they want to know more about it, and they want to know the people who live here, and they want a sense of pride. To some
Yeah,
degree, if
yeah,
the
it's
only
real.
way we envision a city is through multi-million or multi-billionaires who build a building, that's not a particularly relatable place, which is what I think alienated a lot of people of my generation from thinking that Las Vegas had a past worth investigating. But once you get to the ground level and start talking to people who've had these experiences is when you start to appreciate the value of how there's an impulse of being a community scholar or community activist or a scholar activist, the value that many people place within that as alongside your position within the classroom at the university.
Let me pick up a little bit then, since you sort of talk a bit about your research and ask you about that in relation to the field of Black studies. You've outlined it a good bit already, but you work with historical methods, memory studies, politics, locality, and as you said, you have a history PhD and fondness for archives and historical
Mhm.
methods. And I'm interested in how that sort of collage of approaches that you have, how you think your work fits in the history of Black studies. Sort of how does it fit in the field's past, but also what boundaries do you think it pushes, or what new horizons do you think it helps open up?
Yeah, it's a great question. Because I guess in some ways I've never thought of myself as particularly innovative in the sense that I don't think I develop, theories that are going to be groundbreaking. I just, in some ways, ask questions that I think are relevant to what I think people want to know more about, including myself. And so I guess to kind of retailor the way I'll approach the question is that I've always, as I think I mentioned earlier, I've always been interested in kind of broader questions. And memory studies, I think for me was to some degree accidental as far as looking at it as a framework or a method under which I utilize in my work, because I think within a Black studies context, memory is kind of embedded in many ways within the work that a lot of people do. So, for instance, I was formally trained as a scholar of Atlantic slavery, but particularly the African diaspora, but from the perspective of the enslaved, very much inspired by that 1970s scholarship that emerged, usually called the cultural turn in the history of slavery. People like Eugene Genovese, John Blassingame, contributed to that framework where they were rejecting this idea that you only write about slavery or enslaved people from the perspective of a master class. Like the plantation documents are the key. This was the old U.B. Phillips model, to where there was this paternalist framework towards studying the Black past. Now, people like Carter G. Woodson and Du Bois had always rejected that, but you start to see that influence, I think, largely through the push of the post-civil rights movement era, the late 1960s, to where a new generation of scholars is going to utilize new resources, or at least resources that had been ignored, to uncover what slavery was like from the perspective of the enslaved. But not just through how they viewed their labor, how they viewed their lives, how they viewed themselves as humans, as people. And so in many ways, I think that humanity, the concept of humanity is a framework that Black studies is very interested in. And when these cultural historians in the 70s kind of instituted this new framework, they were very interested in these oral histories, the WPA collections that were taken in the 1930s, that you asked people who were much older about their experiences being born in slavery. Now, the traditional kind of white academics had rejected those sources for a very long time. Now, there were a few individuals like John B. Cade who had used them, published in I believe, in the Journal of African American History, where a lot of, Black academics or Black educators would go out to communities and they would interview the elders and ask them about their experiences. But it does seem that there was this nature within academic history at the time, dominated by kind of a Eurocentric narrative, to where you couldn't trust certain sources over others. But the rejection of that, this idea that memory can actually be a very important vantage point to analyze the past and the present, in that these sources can be used for two different reasons, or at least two interconnected reasons, perhaps. One is that they are talking about their experiences prior to 1865. So you might get something along the lines of the food they ate. But also for me, the question that I was asking is, what were the marriage rituals that they used? What did it mean to be married as an enslaved person from the perspective of the enslaved? Because if we use just the legal category, then no enslaved person was ever married, because that kind of legal contract is the way that it was defined under kind of the white-dominated era. But for enslaved people, they believed they were married. And in many ways, after the Civil War ends, they reject the Freedmen's Bureau's idea that somehow their marriages under slavery didn't count. And so for me, that was always such a compelling point, to where when you adjust your lens to understand an institution from the perspective of those who had to challenge it, it yields a lot more fruitful sources for understanding people on their own terms. And so the other aspect of this is that these individuals were also remembering things. And even if certain things were a little hazy in their memory, that's still actually very important, because it does show kind of how things and memories travel with people as they age and how they present that material to people. And so I found that I could use these resources much more broadly than conventionally considered, to where they could be sources both for the antebellum era prior to the Civil War, as well as even understanding Reconstruction, as well as the advent of Jim Crow in the United States.
That was fantastic. Thank you. It's funny you said, well, I'm going to tailor the question. You actually ended up addressing the question so precisely.
Oh, thanks.
I really love that. I mean, it's like historical, yes, but this notion of memory and tying it specifically to that question of marriage is so important and interesting, and just an excellent example of this history memory question, but also as you put it, sort of where you're research is pushing some boundaries or trying to take us into a different kind of horizon of understanding Black life. So thank you for that. The memory questions of history and memory were also such a part of my shift. I mean, I come from philosophy rather than history, but um, it was really nice to hear you talk about that. My own nostalgia for my own moments, sort of
Sure.
moving across those same questions. Those
Yeah.
those discussions about memory in the late '80s and '90s just enormously important.
Yeah.
Um, so I have two more questions for you. This one is sort of looking at the field of Black studies in a broad frame, past, future, to ask you, what is it that you think the field of Black studies has done particularly well, but also what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot about this question now that I'm chairing a department in which the Black Studies program or concentration is embedded within it. So I was hired to teach in African American, African diaspora studies, but now I'm chairing a department within that's within it, and I do think kind of from the institutional framework now, like the administrative aspect of this. And so, I mean, on the one hand, when you study the advent of Black studies departments and curriculum more broadly, a lot of these curriculums were adopted pretty quickly, objectively speaking, when you're talking about the past. Maybe not fast enough in certain respects, but there were pretty significant victories in that
Yeah.
initial era to where you started to see a much broader representation of the curriculum in, traditionally white institutions. So, I mean, I think that was a victory, objectively speaking, in that it did become embedded within the institution. There was at least an imprint within it. One thing, sometimes critiques are localized because I think some departments and programs are just stronger than others, just by nature of sheer numbers to some degree. But speaking, I think even more personally about the situation at UNLV is that I think there's one thing that perhaps it's always difficult to predict, but we can never take for granted, and I tell my students this, we can never take for granted that these programs or majors exist, right? I mean, we know they're here, um, but a lot of the young people that are coming into our classes, they don't really have a historical context as to the type of fight that it took to actually get the universities and other institutions to recognize the value of
Yeah.
these particular disciplines, or this interdisciplinary framework for studying uh, historically marginalized people. And so I always tell them, I'm like, we do need to ensure that we are constantly at least have a framework for how we protect these places
Yeah.
that are of value. Because every student I meet, even if they're not majoring with us, often if they're not majoring with us, believes that the courses that we teach gave them something that their major didn't. But if universities still use the metric that majors are the key to a program's success, we have to be aware that we can never take for granted that these things exist. And so we have to look for more creative approaches to ensure that these courses, these ideas, these concepts stay. Um, both in the institution, but also if they don't in the institution for whatever reason. I mean, we see things happening in certain states throughout the United States currently, is that at the very least, the community will understand that there is value to what's being offered here, and that in some way, shape, or form, that the programs that we have or the concepts that we teach can still resonate within the community. Because if these programs and departments exist because of community input and community activism and student activism, then we need to make sure that it's not just staying within the institution, but that a lot of these ideas are also redirected back to the community and there's a mutually beneficial relationship. And I'm not sure if we think about that enough.
I
It's
agree.
just simply because when something becomes institutionalized, it's there. Sometimes people don't think about the possibilities of what could happen, but one thing that I think happened in a lot of places is the Great Recession was kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people to
Absolutely.
where the supposedly kind of uh, low yield majors were always at threat of cancellation or consolidation. And so that's, I think, a reality for a lot of people. And as we see kind of the nature of the global economy and the way things are going, even with the advent of AI, anti-DEI policies, a post-humanities world to some degree, we do have to make sure that we are finding ways to protect what we're doing, because it's not just for us, it's not just for jobs, but this is for value for people, for the communities under which we serve.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And it's such a on the one hand, a really complicated thing because, as you said, the multiple forces of economic pressure, post-humanities world, the recession, as you said, revealed so many things. It's kind of like, when the tide goes out and you see like everything that's under the water,
Yeah,
and the tide might come back in a little bit, but this tide might permanently go out. But
right.
also when you add to that the ideological pressures of a far right fascist government, anti-DEI policies being the sort of first wave of those attacks. I mean, this had very real effects. I mean, Indiana University's department was just completely,
Man.
bombed out, within a couple of weeks. And, the idea that it may happen only to a couple of departments is a terrible strategy. We ought to
Right.
all be thinking, as you said, about, have we thought and acted sufficiently so that there is a place for us, right? Not as
Yeah.
I like that you said, not just for our jobs. Our jobs matter, to us,
Mhm.
but to this broader question of it matters to people.
Yeah.
That phrase will really stick with me. It matters to people, and who are the people we've made sure we matter to whom we make sure we matter is such a compelling question. I'm going to take that to my department. Actually, I really appreciate that. Like the way you put that is um, really moved me, and so that's why I'm going on about it a little bit. So thank you for that.
Well, no, thank you for saying that. It is something that I have a very supportive group of faculty that I work with, and so we do talk about these questions a lot as to, we do believe we will survive. We believe we'll exist. We do believe we do important work, but we have tried to find ways under which we can maybe even do some unconventional things that set us apart to some degree to showcase the value of the things that we do. And so, excuse me, we've talked about, starting a discussion series that is not academic in nature, but that it prioritizes community voices where they can be in conversation with scholars at the university, but represent the broader Las Vegas community. And to my knowledge, there aren't a lot of lecture series like that. Usually, like lecture series is a distinguished person who gives a talk on their research. People tend to like it. People are excited about it, but we're trying to do something different, which I think is more in the spirit of a traditional Black studies approach to community engagement, like a community scholar alignment, to where we view ourselves at the service of both the institution and the students, but also at the service of the community we represent. Because, I mean, UNLV, um, as I was growing up in particular, there are more institutions of higher education now in the Valley, but UNLV always represented Las Vegas in some ways. And so if we are going to honor that kind of commitment and reputation as, faculty in ethnic, gender, and sexuality studies, we should institute programming that speaks to the needs of the broader Las Vegas community that we represent.
It's a shifting version of what a university is, and I think, like, I mean, we're talking the Black Studies podcast. We're both in the Black Studies departments, but um, this is just a vision of like an education that's expansive and voracious rather than struggling to survive under austere conditions. I like that sense of proliferation through humanity rather than through a different budget, because no great budgets are on the way as far as I can tell. So
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one piece of this as to what we're addressing. We can do a lot with a little.
Well, let me ask you then this last question, and maybe you've already begun to answer it or answered it. But in a sort of Black Studies context, what is the question you would want us to all be asking, or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
Yeah, I think it does kind of expound upon the previous point, but with maybe a little more fine tuning in that I think most of us know we are existing within institutions of higher education that are really based upon a neoliberal type of model. And I teach at a state school, which is largely first generation underrepresented students. Many of them work and have, family responsibilities. Many of them are kind of like me. They work, they live here at home, and they commute to campus. So that's kind of the nature of most institutions that I've taught at, actually. And so there is kind of a narrative that many students are coming in with, which is understandable that they feel this way, to where you get a degree to kind of change your economic circumstances. And so what degree do you choose? You go to STEM, business, in Las Vegas, hospitality, as you can imagine, is probably a very popular major for that regard. And so there's kind of two approaches to the ways under which, maybe a question we should be asking is, in the event that this model can't be prevented, if it's going to continue and perpetuate in this way. One aspect is what I previously mentioned, engagement with the community through ethnic studies and Black studies faculty. The other is finding ways to ensure that the students who are kind of going into those other majors also have an introduction to what we do. So one of the things that we've started to do in my department is kind of a pretty vigorous campaign of cross-listing in areas that have not traditionally been attached to, Black studies more broadly. So that way, there's at least an alignment to where we are ensuring students that there's an option over here if you are curious about something, that what we offer can benefit you because we are teaching you how to think through issues. We're also setting a context under which people have challenged the status quo and they've come up with new ideas that is for the mutual benefit of everybody. Kind of the concept of liberation and activism in real time has changed the world. But we can never take for granted that exists, that you have to keep pursuing liberty and keep pursuing an activist framework. And you can do so within your conventional profession. So I think that that's one question that is urgent, in that the neoliberal institution seems to be here to stay for a while. And there is this necessity to adapt without surrendering the foundations of what we do. So I would say that the position of the academic discipline within the current neoliberal model needs to be a subject of that we need to continue to question and address.
What a fantastic place to wrap up, that adapt without surrendering the foundations.
Yeah.
That's an art form and a craft, but hopefully that's actually what we're trained to do, right? Especially if, just to go back to your very first comment, first part of this podcast, if we really believe in the transformative human part of education, right? This certainly is an art that we can work with and work on creatively and together, rather than scheming in our studies. So I love that you brought that to the table. What does it mean to work within this as well as be a critic? And this has just been such a fantastic conversation, Tyler. I was looking forward to it. This is, a really fantastic contribution to this series, and just I really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness and insights. So just, very, very appreciate it. I know everybody listening will think the same.
Well, I appreciate that, and I do want to emphasize that it really is an honor to be here. I mean, I know the guest list that you've had on this podcast, and I admire many of if not all of them. And it's just an honor that I could be counted among them. So thank you for the invitation. And this is great for me as well.
Well, I know I speak for Bree, Olivia, and Ashley when I say it's our pleasure to host you and have you on the podcast. So thank you for all of that, and have a great rest of your day.
You as well. Thanks so much.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.